confronting what we see as the moral crisis of mass incarceration. As is so often the case in this city, we meet at a time of tragedy, with the senseless murder yesterday of Police Commander Paul Bauer. Our prayers go out to him and to his family, and to all victims of crime in this city, with prayers also for support of those who are dedicated, as those who are here tonight, to developing a criminal justice system that operates to make us all safer, and does so without demonizing individuals or communities of color. In our first three sections, we have learned a lot about the cycle of crime and punishment that has taken hold of us in our country. We've learned about how the drive toward longer sentences for more and more offenses has swelled the prison population far beyond what is required for public safety. We have learned how far we have to go to improving the experience in prison, so that it prepares inmates to lead productive lives rather than training them to commit more and more serious crimes and create more victims. We have learned how restrictions on the lives of those who are released from prison constitute a continued form of punishment, often for the rest of their lives, driving many to commit more crimes and create more victims. And we have learned about the vast and disproportionate impact of all of these factors on people and communities of color. And we have learned about alternatives to incarceration and programs for assisting those leaving prison that have proved effective, but that lack resources to be applied broadly enough to benefit most returning citizens. Tonight we will focus, I think, on the process of apprehension, arrest, prosecution, conviction, and sentencing that leads to the incarceration of those accused or convicted of a crime, and on efforts to improve and reform that process as it has developed in this country and this county over the years. This involves laws that define criminal behavior and the sentences to be imposed upon conviction of a crime, the process of arrest and charging of a crime, the treatment of accused individuals pending trial, the exercise of prosecutorial discretion in pursuing a conviction or plea bargain, and the manner in which trials are conducted and the manner in which damning or exculpatory evidence is treated before, during, and after trial. As we know, this involves issues of resources and issues of many difficult judgments along the way. We're honored to have here with us tonight to help us understand how these issues play out Cook County State's Attorney Tim Fox, Cook County Public Defender Amy Campanelli, the Executive Director of the Illinois Criminal Justice Information Authority, John Mackey, and the Criminal Justice Reform Project Director of the ACLU, Ben Bedell. And once again, our moderator is Rob Wildebor, who is the Senior News Director of WBPC. Thank you.
Good evening. It's good to be back here again. This group, as John just said in his intro, has been meeting for the last 4 weeks. I think what we have here is there are some criminal justice professionals who work in the field in some way, but there's a lot of people, I think, in here who are just engaged citizens as well who want to learn more about that. And so it's, it's great to see you all out here to learn more about this. And so we're going to just mostly have a conversation tonight. As John alluded to, the shooting this week of Commander Paul Bauer, who, I don't know, are we in the 18th district here? Is a tragic event that, it is just deeply troubling and deeply sad. And it also puts us at kind of an interesting time to have the fourth session of this conversation, because it's really one of those cases, I think, that puts in stark relief some of the issues that the public, people like you, need to understand deeply, I think, in order to make any of the kind of changes that a lot of people here on this stage would like to make. So there's a lot to talk about tonight, and we'll mostly be doing that in conversation. But Ms. Campanelli had some thoughts she had prepared a little more formally, so we wanted to start with that and then we'll move into conversation, and later we'll have some time for questions.
Okay, I'm going to start with a quick little video and then just give my thoughts on what I've been doing in my office and about what's going on.
Time capsule, man. I get mad at myself when I look back on all the things that I've missed. Little pops. That one mistake robbed me of a lot of years, man.
Going all over the world as we moving. It's not going to be easy. I'm getting dizzy right now, trying to survey the land. All the new stuff that I see, I didn't know what it was. I mean, it's a gift shop. You wouldn't think you would go through something like that.
Sorry, I've been away for so long.
All right, shoot up. As a mother, it's scary now coming back out, trying to do this the right way.
I did question sometimes, like, what would happen if I had him in mind?
I was going to ask you, what about you?
I'm not gonna run to your beck and call. I could care less if you stay in there another 10 years. It's too late for you to try to be that father that I've always wanted to just be there.
That hurt pain is because of me.
Looking at this new life, I am scared.
What am I here for if I can't provide it for my family?
I don't worry about who's hanging out with the wrong people. All it takes is one slip up and you can be gone right back.
I don't have the leeway to push back the daggone 6 o'clock curfew with this stupid bracelet on.
I feel like a dog on a chain. I just did 19 years. Leave me alone.
It's all about you. I can prove it down all of you. Yeah, I ain't got to stay here. Come on, sit down. It's like I'm running for my life this time.
I'm not going to go back. I'm not going back.
So, you've been talking about mass incarceration, and, you know, the phrase mass incarceration is thrown around a lot, and everyone agrees, I think, that it's wrong and must be corrected. But I want to just show you this video to highlight a point that I think is missing from the discussion. People are not incarcerated in mass. We incarcerate people one at a time. And if you look at people one at a time, you will treat them with dignity and respect. Because once people are looked at en masse and lose their individuality, they become statistics. And there's a cliche that I'm sure many of you have heard: one death is a tragedy, 100,000 deaths is a statistic. So the people in the video have names, oh there we go, that's better, and stories. And there's no humanity behind statistics. So too many people are characterized by stereotypes, such as, it's another black man from the South Side. But you never hear anyone say, oh, another white man from Mount Prospect was arrested. So our bias is very clear. We've reduced people to geographic and racial stereotypes. But in order to get to reform and change, we have to go behind the stereotypes and get to the underlying humanity. There's no more important place to treat people with dignity, respect, individuality, unbiased than the criminal court system. Once it becomes easy to send a man to prison because of geography and race, the integrity of justice has completely evaporated. So when I became the public defender of Cook County in 2015, I wanted to provide a more holistic defense to all of our clients. And at the same time, I wanted to push the criminal court system itself to change and treat those who are caught up in the process holistically and individually, and humanely, of course. So the idea behind holistic defense is the recognition
that for most poor people who are arrested and are charged with a crime, the criminal case is not the only issue with which they struggle. To be a truly effective advocate, a defense attorney has to go beyond the courtroom. He or she has to look at what is driving the clients into the criminal court system in the first place. If we all did that and examined each person the first time he or she enters the court system, there wouldn't be a second time. So this isn't merely an idea. It works. The Bronx defenders have been using a holistic approach and found that it has reduced recidivism tremendously. By providing access to services and involving the community like yourselves, it stops crime in its tracks. You find a house for someone who's homeless. You find mental health or substance abuse treatment for someone in need. You find a steady job for someone who is desperate, and you can prevent crime from occurring. That is why I have strongly supported having restorative justice courts as an alternative to the criminal court system. So restorative justice sees a criminal act not as simply as breaking the law, but causing harm to people, to relationships, and to the community. So the community helps craft the proper response to that harm, which addresses both the wrongdoing that occurred and the harm that was caused. So we now have our very first restorative justice court in North Lawndale on the west side, and it is already working. We need to recognize that criminal court is ill-suited to healing community wounds. It doesn't transform an offender into someone who appreciates the harm that he has caused, so he won't do it again. Restorative justice court can do that and helps the offender with the issues that brought him into the system in the first place. Now, another concept that the community should endorse is to reform the way we do bond court. And my solution is simple and direct: eliminate cash bond. So how a judge sets bail should depend on only two things: whether the person in court is a threat to public safety, or whether there's a fear that the person will not return to court, he will flee. Bail should not be used to punish someone or coerce them into pleading guilty just to get out of custody, out of jail. Money should not be involved. Now, for several decades in our criminal court system here in Cook County, the reality was that high bonds were set for people who had no money. Setting bond was a fiction. A judge would require someone with no money to get out of jail only if he posted $1,000, $10,000 or more. It was a way to pretend to set bond and comply with the law, while really keeping people in jail until their criminal case was over. They had no chance of being released, even though they were innocent until proven guilty, remember. So it also punished innocent people into pleading guilty and pushed them pleading guilty just so they could get out of jail. And that's not what we want from our court system. That's not justice. And one of the uglier aspects of this system that has lasted for several decades here in Cook County is that it disproportionately affects minorities, and I think John touched on it. So African Americans and Hispanics comprise the vast majority of the Cook County jail population, as many of you probably know and have been reading in the paper. The jail cannot and should not be a holding place for people of color merely because they are poor. At the same time, if someone is a threat to someone or a flight risk, he shouldn't get out of jail, no matter how much money he has. Someone who isn't dangerous should not have to spend a dime. Someone who is should not be released for any amount of money. It makes sense. So Kim Fox, Chief Judge Evans, Sheriff Dart, President Preckwinkle, Clerk Brown, retired federal Judge David Corr, the Illinois Supreme Court, and myself have been working together for several years already to reform bond court. And last September, I submitted a proposal to the Illinois Supreme Court asking that the justices consider implementing a new rule for setting bond for the entire state of Illinois, not just Cook County. And it would require that if bail is set for someone who's not a safety threat, the judge must consider the person's present financial ability to pay the bond. The idea of setting a bond that is unaffordable as a substitute for holding someone in jail indefinitely is hopefully a thing of the past. Lastly, concerning bail. So effective January 1st, the governor signed into law a bail reform bill that created a number of firsts for Illinois. It created a presumption that any conditions of release not be based on money. Also, for people who cannot afford bond, it requires that they return to court within 7 days. so the judge can decide whether he or she should modify the bond. In addition, it asks the Supreme Court to establish a risk assessment tool, which basically is an algorithm that can be used to predict who might be dangerous, who might be a flight risk. Lastly, the law provides that a person receives a credit of $30 a day against their bail for every day that he spends waiting in jail and cannot make bond. So let's put this into real terms that you can understand. Suppose you have a friend who's arrested. And at bond court, the judge should start with the presumption that if he isn't a threat to others or a flight risk, he should be released on his own signature. In other words, his promise to come back to court and comply with the laws while he's out on bond. If the judge does set bond and your friend cannot afford the bond, he'll be brought back to court within a week and ask for his release. And suppose he has to post $1,000 to get out. With a credit of $30 a day, he'll be able to be released without posting any money after 34 days. So that's the new one. But there are other laws that I feel are detrimental to treating people as individuals and antagonistic to a community approach to justice. Last year, the Safe Neighborhoods Reform Act imposed a presumptive sentence of between 6 to 7 years in prison for someone convicted of unlawfully having a firearm. Now, my problem with this law is that it takes all the discretion away from the judge. The law ties the judge's hands and prevents him from considering the individuality of the person before him. Now, as a defense attorney, I should be free to argue that a lower sentence should be given if there are extenuating circumstances. The person's never been in trouble before. Things like that. The person's in school. The person has a job. He needs to get back to the community. There are other safeguards we can put in place to make sure that he doesn't pick up that gun. Likewise, the prosecutor should be free to argue for a higher sentence if there are extenuating, other aggravating circumstances. But the judge is denied that freedom to decide what is best for both the person before him and the community. And that's not justice. That's legislative rubber stamp. And remember, in court, you have the judge, you have a defense attorney, you have the prosecutor. They're the best people in the room to decide what is the best outcome for this case, not the legislature. So there's also a new proposed bill that you've probably been reading about recently that Mayor Emanuel is proposing to allegedly stop carjackings. Now, I've seen the bills introduced in both the House and the Senate this week, and they don't amend the carjacking statute. Instead, they change the law that prohibits possessing or being in a stolen car. Now, that doesn't make sense. You don't fight carjacking by making it easier to convict someone for joyriding, just like you don't fight armed robbery by making it easier to convict someone for receiving stolen property. The kid who is sitting in a stolen car is not a carjacker. If he is, he should be charged with carjacking. So a better approach is what they're doing in Florida, where the sheriff's office is working with the county's mental health agency to address carjackings by dealing with the underlying causes of why the person is carjacking. Again, going back to the point I made at the start, it looks at the individuals involved. No one said this is easy, but if we really want to reduce crime and improve life, we need to focus on what is important. As I wrap up, I just want to point out that when people are arrested, they need a lawyer. We have lawyers every day, right? They write our wills, they help us get divorced, they help us enter into contracts, but we don't have access to a lawyer when our most precious commodity, our liberty, is at risk. But since last March, Chief Judge Timothy Evans signed a court order that everyone in Cook County who is arrested and at the police station has the right to have a public defender. And I believe that once this is fully implemented, false confessions and therefore wrongful convictions will decrease and the integrity of the criminal justice system will increase. I have flyers when you came in that have the phone number, I have cards to pass out. I'm asking you that everyone in Cook County knows that they can have a lawyer, no matter rich or poor, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And in conclusion, I just want to play, too long for that? Okay, I might play that later. So, I'll stop there. I know we're going to get to some more stuff, but I just wanted to say a few words. Thank you.
Okay, so there's a lot there that I think we'll probably come back to over the next few minutes. Ms. Fox, I wanted to ask you, what are some of the reforms that you have been working on that you support, and what are some, maybe three of each, three reforms that you guys have been working on, and three that you'd like to do but just haven't or can't yet?
So it's 6 altogether. Okay. First, let me also, to this community, express my condolences on the loss of Commander Bauer. It is definitely a heartbreaking week, not just for the commander's family and for the district, but for the entire city and for the county. And recognizing that we're sitting in the 18th district, I would be remiss to not acknowledge the tremendous loss that we have seen in the city. I start too with, in times like this, as Rob talked about, talking about issues of reform in this heightened sense of what's happening to us. When we talk about what's happening with the recent spat of carjackings, when we see what has happened with Commander Bauer, I think the notion of reform seems foreign to talk about when we're talking about violence in such a visceral way. And I think we have to make sure that when we are having these conversations, to the point that Amy made, that reform is not just for reform's sake. We're really trying to prevent violent crime. Violent crime prevention, at the end of the day, I think is something that we could all agree on. Our approaches may be different from a prosecutor standpoint and a defense attorney standpoint, but public safety is our primary goal. And the recognition in talking about the justice system in areas where we can shore things up is aimed to that end. When we talk about things, for example, like bail reform, which is one of the things that we were working on in conjunction with the Public Defender's Office and other stakeholders, is what we were finding was that we had a lot of people who were in our jails who were there, many of them for non-violent offenses, with bail amounts that they could not afford. And at the same time, we saw that some folks who were engaged in really egregious violence were able to post money to get out. So how can that be? We see a lot of people who are engaged in criminal enterprises, maybe around drug wars where violence is part of the business. But when you find that when someone is engaged in an enterprise like that, who's made a lot of money off of that, their ability to go get money to pay bond is pretty high. But when we looked and we saw that we had a man in jail, for example, who was sitting in jail for 3 months for stealing $300 worth of shoes at a cost to taxpayers of $160 a day, and he hadn't even gone to trial. That's not justice. That's not keeping us safer. And so really talking about bond reform and the fact that we are not necessarily safer by having people detained pre-trial unnecessarily. To Amy's point, I'm a prosecutor. I wholeheartedly believe that there are some people who are a threat to our public safety who ought to be separated from us from the moment of arrest. But I also recognize that the majority of the people who are in our jail don't fit that category. And I want to ease some of your concern when you read headlines and see statistics that that population of folks who are causing that harm is a small fraction of the people who are in this city and in this county. But we can't have blanket policies that treat the person who is stealing a pair of shoes in the exact same way that we treat someone who commits first-degree murder. That's not how we operate. One of the other things that we worked on, too, was retail theft. And I will tell you, a lot of people got really agitated at our office because we used our prosecutorial discretion to raise the threshold for felony retail theft here in Cook County. What prosecutorial discretion means is that I, as the prosecutor, have the ability to say what we charge, what we won't charge, what we recommend or not. In Illinois, the felony threshold for retail theft is $300. $300. In the liberal bastion that is Indiana, it's $750. Our neighbors to the north, it's $2,000. And so the question is, why does that matter? Well, when we talk about prevention, we all have to look at the full spectrum, as Amy said, holistically. We see a lot of people who are engaged in these types of behaviors, shoplifting, who don't come at it alone. They come with a constellation of issues. Maybe it's drug addiction. Maybe it's homelessness. Maybe they're stealing to help aid whatever ill that they have. But when we have the easy availability of a conviction, a felony conviction, it impedes your ability on the back end to be able to be reintegrated into society. A felony conviction essentially cuts you off from the ability to get a job. It limits your ability to find housing. It limits your ability to get education. Why does that matter? Why do I care? Why should you care? Because when people don't have the ability to reintegrate into our communities, the likelihood of them engaging in criminal behavior increases. I can't get a job. I can't get housing. I live in a neighborhood that has not had economic investment. What do I do? When we see in certain neighborhoods across the city where the unemployment rate is extraordinarily high, it is incredibly difficult, not just for folks who don't have a criminal conviction to get jobs. Those people who have that on their record makes it even more difficult. We did a heat map of where the most violence in the city is. You will find a concentration of people returning from our prisons. I'm sure John can speak more to that, on top of the conviction rate, the inability to get a job and the like. So from our vantage point, we looked at retail theft as a way to say, listen, it was the second highest offense that was charged in Cook County. I know people we just came out with our data report in the last couple of days from our office. Number one was unlawful use of weapon. Number two was retail theft. And it just didn't make sense. We're churning, we're doing things that we've always done, and we haven't looked at the consequences once we're done. To Amy's point, most retailers don't want you to steal from them. The price of an item goes up, how they pay for security and the like. They want you to buy from them. And if years from now you can't earn a living to come in and be a contributor to their bottom line, and you're just a cost factor, we should think of ways that we can stop you from stealing and not impede your ability to eventually contribute to society. And then third, wrongful convictions. We've spent the last year adamantly working on our conviction integrity unit. What we know in this city is that we have had a history, and part of the reason some of the relationships in our communities, particularly communities of color, that are fraught with tension with law enforcement is this history, this legacy that has been there. And if we don't address past harms, if we don't say, listen, we recognize that there are people in our jails and prisons who are there for crimes that they didn't commit, acknowledge it, fix it, and actively work to not have it happen again, the very people that we need to come in and help us fight crime won't come. We have a homicide clearance rate of 17% in the city of Chicago. That means 83 out of 100 people who may have committed murder are not being picked up. And there's a myriad of reasons for that. But I know one of those reasons is that there's a fear that the system is not going to be fair and just, and it's not worth the risk. And I, as a system holder, have to demonstrate that I hear you, we believe in fairness and equity, and we believe that we have an obligation to fix things that are wrong and acknowledge them. So those are the three things we've worked on. Things we need to work on, obviously, juvenile offense. A lot of the young people that we see coming through our juvenile justice system graduate into our adult justice system. And I know that particularly as we talk about carjackings, there's this notion that we're slapping kids' hands on the wrist, and the tougher we get, the more that they'll stop doing that. And what I will tell you, what I would challenge all of you, how many out here are parents? Raise your hand if you're a parent. Okay, I want you to go back and remember, the harder you punished your child, and they still did the same dumb stuff, I'm in a church, dumb stuff, a week later. when we were all young people before, how many of us have engaged and done things that we look back on our lives and say, holy smokes, can you believe it? And recognize that how we respond to young people right now, even when they do things that anger us, that defy logic, that we recognize our response to that will dictate how they matriculate into our systems. The younger they are, I see 12-year-olds, 13-year-olds with handguns. My first thought when I see a 12-year-old with a gun is what in the world is happening in his life that he has a gun? And if we don't answer those questions and say, well, the way we'll deal with them is just lock him away, what we're doing is hardening what's already there, and we are all at risk. We're all at risk. So juvenile, working on more effective juvenile programs, working on better diversion. We have a significant number of people who come through our criminal justice system who are drug addicted and have mental health issues. That is a reality, that is a fact. As we think about what's happening with the opioid crisis and how many people it has touched, what we have to realize, our empathy and sympathy for those who are struggling with this, is that the place to deal with it is not in our jails. I have a number of people who are in our jails because we don't have other places for them to go. We don't have places to take people who are in mental health crises. We take them to our hospital, we take them to our jail. That is, if there was ever a place where if you're in the middle of a mental health crisis, locking you in a cell with others at 26 in California exacerbates, not makes it better. And the sad reality is, most of these people come out and go back into the same conditions, and then we'll see them again. So again, it's a matter of public safety that we don't exacerbate problems that we know exist. And then lastly, I think we are actively working on kind of a culture change to make sure that our office is more responsive to the communities that we serve. People talk about this tension, you know, the war that people feel that there is on law enforcement. My office is a law enforcement office. And we have a lot of work to do to reconcile with the communities that we serve by being actively engaged and responsive to the needs of the people that we serve, and particularly those in communities of color which see the highest levels of violence in their communities. So those are the 3 things we need to work on. 6 things.
I want to get to Ben and John in a minute here, but I do want to ask one question, Ms. Fox, because, you know, a lot of people here are wanting to learn about this so they can get involved and have some impact and something meaningful. And one of the things we heard from David Olson in the first session was a lot of politicians talk a lot about, like, you know, we've heard a lot over the last couple of years about, oh, the low-level nonviolent drug offender. Everyone's like, yeah, let's solve mass incarceration, let them go, of course, that makes sense. And he was saying, well, that person is kind of like a unicorn, in a sense, in our prison system. The people who are there are repeat offenders, many of them in for violent crimes. He was saying, you know, a lot of the sentences for murders used to be 10, 15 years in the 70s. Now they're 45 years, and that's why we have such a high prison population. And it's very questionable what the public safety benefit of that is. You know, 15 years versus 35 or 45. And I'm wondering, so he was suggesting that would be one of the key things to do, and I'm wondering what you think of that idea.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's why I started with the conversation that in most audiences that I go to, and I'm sure the other panelists go to, there's a connection that people make that longer sentences make us safer, right? People think that you know, I've heard even just over the course of this particular week, when we look at, you know, people in the news who's a repeat felon, I keep hearing the word repeat felon, and you ask the question of, yes, this person has been in prison and they've done their time, and then there's this notion, well, this person shouldn't be out. And so you have to ask, well, what do you think is appropriate? When we have these moments of visceral things happening, most people aren't in prison for the rest of their lives. So I'll start backwards. About, what is it, John? How many people are there for life?
I mean, most people, the average sentence is something like, or let's say a year and a half.
They're coming out.
People burn through it.
Yeah.
Or people stack up.
But they come come back out, and if we don't have an investment in the return, the sentence and the stack up doesn't matter. Once they come out, they're gonna go back in. I don't know any other model, like our criminal justice system or our penal system, where the recidivism rate, which is, what is it, John? Like 60%?
Depends how you count it, but.
Let's say 60%. Then you can have a 60% fail rate and still invest in doing the same things. But it is hung on this principle of safety, that we have equated safety with sentence length, and not safety with what do you do with people who've done harm? How do we actually make sure that they don't do the harm again by investing in them? And I will say, and I know John and then we'll talk more about this, as a prosecutor, you don't generally hear prosecutors saying, we have to invest in what happens when people go into our incarceration system. You have to. If they go in damaged, broken, into a system that it causes further damage, brokenness, and then come back among us, they're gonna bring their damage and brokenness back to all of us. That's just a fact. And so, you know, I think it's right. I think, you know, the number, we get hung up in believing that, you know, someone's gotta be in there at 45 will be safe because they're isolated. And that has not borne out in the research. We cannot continue to do criminal justice policy by gut, right? Or by some event happens that scares the hell out of us, and we need a response to make us feel better. And then we look back and we see that we've caused more harm than good. So I think Dave is right, but I think we as a culture, as a community, have to dispel ourselves of the notion that prison and lengthy sentences make us safer, and be comfortable with having shorter sentences coupled with real meaningful rehabilitation and opportunity on the back end.
So you've got a bunch of people in this room who I think by their attendance here, it's probably safe to assume many of them would be supportive of that kind of thing and reform. And yet I bet a lot of them want to see Mr. Leggett or Leggett get a long time in prison. I'm wondering, like, you know, given that visceral, I feel, you know, myself is very, very distressing this week.
Me too.
So what kind of sentence should a guy like that get?
Listen, I mean, I think, obviously I can't discuss that case in particular because our office is prosecuting that case. I think there is also, you know, a balancing act that we do as prosecutors as, you know, if someone has a history of cycling in and out, and the elevation of crime. So what we want to try to do is stop people from elevating. You stop from being someone who's possessing drugs to then someone who's robbing, and then someone who's robbing with a weapon, and then someone who commits a murder. I think there's a tolerance level that we can all acknowledge, but the escalation into violence, I think, means that the punishment is more severe. I can't tell you what that looks like across the board. I think that is you have to look individually on each of these cases, but that's a consideration that we have is what is the length? What have been the interventions? What have been the opportunities? And with the realization that all of the failures on some of these opportunities aren't just owned by the defendant. Like there are systems that are not in place for some folks to succeed. But at the same time, there has to be that personal accountability. There has to be a point where that escalation cannot continue. And when it comes to the taking of a life, the ultimate of crimes, there is a penalty to pay for that.
John, what is the shooting death of Commander Bauer this week? What does that mean for like efforts at criminal justice reform? It seems like it's the kind of case that just sticks viscerally in the public consciousness.
A lot to talk about here. I want to first thank host for inviting me. I'm so honored to be here. Honored to be here with a lot of folks I've worked with and talked with over the years. I'm especially just thrilled the leadership we have in Cook County, Amy Campanelli, Kim Fox. They're both on my board, and we're really lucky to have people like this in Cook County. I brought my son here. I guess, you know...
Ben, you and me are awesome
yeah.
too.
So what does a case like Commander Bowers do to criminal justice? I mean, I think we have to approach this issue with really great humility. So I think it's very easy. I think there's an issue that it's seductively simple, you know, and I'm sure I've been seduced by this. I know, you know, like the phrase I hate hearing in this kind of space is, oh, this is not rocket science, this is what you do, or people who have kind of very, and you know, it doesn't matter if you're, you know, in the criminal justice kind of actor, law enforcement, or an advocate, people tend, I think, to gravitate towards very simple answers. And they can do that in front of very complex or sometimes even horrific problems, right? So maybe one problem is mass incarceration. How do you solve this awful, horrible problem? Well, it's simple, let them go. Or I think of, you know, a real horrific crime. Oh, it's simple, it's longer sentence. Oh, or it's a change in the law. If we'd only had this change in the law, this wouldn't have happened. And I think, you know, I think on one level, we have to resist that kind of simplicity. It's really, it's naive, I think it's arrogant, and it's really, really dangerous. And I think, you know, so that's what I'm worried about, is that people will, I think what's so exciting about right now is that people, I think, are thinking about this issue. And I think a lot of us driven mass incarceration has been a kind of thoughtlessness, you know, kind of a reliance on kind of magical thinking of longer sentences. I think quantitative thinking, you know, oh, longer sentences equals more justice or more safety. It goes back to Amy's opening remarks. I think, ultimately, I think justice is about trying to balance these you know, profoundly competitive interests we have in our justice system. One of them being the law, fairness, and it's all centered around, you know, what the individual deserves. And I think that's really hard to do, especially in the case of like a profound crime like Commander Bowers. But I think also that's also where, I don't know if I'm rambling here or not, but I think the challenge when we have crimes like that is to try to remember not just think about the crime that occurred and what we feel should be done to kind of respond to it, but also who are we in this? And I think the easiest thing to do when something horrible happens is just to want to smash it. I mean, I think that, you know, in my career so far, I guess one thing I've always felt when I've been to prisons or, you know, work with law enforcement or whatever is that, you know, I don't, if something really awful happened to someone I care about, I think I would want blood. I'm pretty sure I'd want that. That is not good policy. I would not be in that moment a person to listen to. And so I think that's a thing that we need to, and also I don't think that would reflect my best self. And I think, you know, that's what we should want from the justice system, is not just what's the easy response or what the response that feels good in a kind of pleasurable way, but kind of can like put to rest like very disquieting thoughts we have and concerns we have. And to keep in mind that there's a human beings, and that also the system that we have, our system of punishment, it's the part of our government that is the most coercive. It can take, you know, we no longer have a death penalty, thank God, in Illinois, but we can take people's life away in terms of bringing to prison. It is an awesome power of the state, and something we should be extremely careful about using. So, again, to go back, I just think we have to keep our wits about us as we try to think about this crime. You know, I don't mean to, you know, interrupt the carjacking and stuff. It's just, you know, the law is not going to save us here. It would be wonderful if it could. It'd be great. It would be, I would think about this. It would be, if prison was this kind of magical answer, it would be wonderful. Wouldn't that be the greatest thing in the world if you could just put people in prison for a few years and then come back out and everything's better? It just doesn't work that way. So I think that's, goes back to it. I think that's, especially for you know, lay citizens, or just when you hear politicians or you think about, you know, horrible crimes, just resist the simple explanation or the simple solution. It does not exist.
Well, that seems kind of bleak for a bunch of people who spent the last 4 weeks trying to figure out what they can do. I mean, what are we supposed to make of that?
Well, I think one is, I don't want to get too political here, but I just, you know, when people come, like, what are you going to do about this problem? Like, well, we're going to increase sentences. Well, that is not going to work. That is not going to work. You know, but I think what you can demand for is, I mean, I think when you get to a crime, I mean, so take the case of Commander Bauer. Well, what's the good outcome there? It's a horrible thing. You know, there's no good thing that's going to come out of that. You're dealing with a really horrible situation that, you know, we don't want to make worse. But I think we can start to ask, you know, questions around maybe it's training, or there are lots of questions we should be asking, and asking our elected officials. Police officer training. I think when the suspects, we learn more about him, I think we should ask questions about, well, how did this person come to be? If he's gone through the system before, I think we should ask, what kinds of interventions did he receive? Again, I agree with that. I've heard some stuff, I just don't want to think it's part of responsibility to talk about what I've heard or not heard. But we can take it as kind of a generic case. I think also one of the simplistic explanations we have for crime is we think of these, like, there are isolated moments in time that can somehow contain everything. And crimes like this crime here, I don't think, most crimes are not like, they're not literal crimes of passion or technical crimes of passion, but they're not completely thoughtful, right? So there are things that happen in kind of really horrible moments, but they're produced by, a multitude of moments. And I think a thoughtful response to crime is elected officials at every level. And I think the criminal justice system is probably, in some ways, the system least equipped to do this. Is to ask, so what are we doing to ensure that people who go through our school, our child welfare systems, have the kinds of experiences that will not lead them to these kind of situations.
Okay, Ben, thank you for waiting so patiently. So I'm curious what your response is to John, because you are actually working on a number of the things that you think could this tweak here and that tweak there. What are some of those? Can you tell us about some of those and what's happening on the state level? And then, there's been a whole bunch said, so I'm sure if I want to give you the chance to weigh in on basically anything else you want to as well.
Okay, in my role at the ACLU, I am a lobbyist as well as a lawyer, and so I spend a lot of time in Springfield, work on legislation, and this is my area. So, and before I did this, I was a staffer handling the same issues in Springfield, and so for a number of years, I've witnessed firsthand the responses that elected officials do have to crime and the kind of laws that are produced by that reactive approach. And much of it's been described here, but it's, we largely make criminal justice policy by anecdote or by a really horrible event that's in the news, and the response is often a punitive response. Let's increase the sentences, let's provide a mandatory minimum so that a judge has no discretion to use probation as an option. Let's create a new crime. There are a whole lot of responses that are reactive in that way, and it almost never produces good policy. And what we have now in our criminal laws is the end result of making law in that way for decades. So we've, this kind of visceral reactive approach isn't new. It just repeats itself, and the law has basically gone in one direction, in a more punitive direction, longer sentences, less discretion, until fairly recently, when we have put the brakes, at least here in Illinois and in a lot of other places. The legislature has mostly put the brakes on that, adding of new crimes, new penalties, mandatory minimums, etc., and started to take a more thoughtful look at things. And in a few cases, we've even moved in the direction of reform, but mostly we've just kind of we're at a bit of a stasis where there's a growing realization that this approach hasn't served us well for public safety, hasn't served us well for what we get for our tax dollars, or what kind of a society we live in. It's just, it's not worked. It's a broken system, and people can disagree and do disagree as to why it's broken. I think this tragic murder of Commander Bauer is, and an individual who I don't know a lot about other than what I've read in the paper so far, but when you see that someone has been through the system, convicted, been to prison multiple times, and commits an act like that, it's pretty clear that that system that the individual's been in is broken. I think some people's reaction is the reactive, sort of approach that's produced the kind of policy we have now, which is it's broken because he should have been locked up. He should have been in a cage, not doing something, not at the Thompson Center with a gun. But I would argue that the real reason it's broken is this person came into contact with the system time and time again. And while I don't know enough to say what sort of interventions did happen, they clearly weren't the right interventions. And we know what the typical interventions are in our criminal justice system, and they're not ones that address the root causes of crime. They are reactive approaches that seek to punish, to incapacitate, and there has been a theory that by, adding years to the sentence associated with a crime, that what you're accomplishing is some level of deterrence, where people are somehow going to look at that law and say, oh, I have a 20-year sentence, that's really serious, I'm not going to commit murder. But that's not how people think when they're committing murder. That's not, and there's plenty of social science research that demonstrates that longer sentences do not produce deterrence. They incapacitate and they punish, they do not deter. And so, when we hear legislators propose these laws, they often do so in the language of sending a message. We need to send a message. But those messages aren't being received. So we really need to do something else. So I want to actually address your question, and because we're talking about violence and long sentences, I'll talk about that first. There are the length of stay for a lot of crimes, but especially violent and sexual crimes, has gone up and up and up. And partly due to increase of sentences, also in large part due to what's called truth in sentencing laws, which is something of a misnomer because they're not really that truthful. But what those provide is that people convicted of certain crimes have to serve 100% of their sentence or 85% of their sentence. They are limited in the amount of good time that they can earn based on good behavior, following the rules, participating in programs, etc., while in prison. And so, we're actually disincentivizing those people from behaving well or participating in programs, but we're also providing that they must be incarcerated for a very, very lengthy period of time, sometimes far longer, years or even decades longer than would possibly be necessary to ensure that that individual's not going to commit another act of violence. We've taken the legislature has done this and taken all the discretion out of the system, and we need to bring that back. And not only do we need to give the Department of Corrections more ability to award sentence credit to people who are incarcerated and following the rules and engaging in pursuits that are rehabilitative, but we need to look at reinstituting some sort of parole where somebody who's received one of these draconian sentences and been incarcerated for a very lengthy period of time already can have what happened in Illinois before 1978, or what still happens in many, many states, a hearing before a parole board to determine what what that person's been doing since they've been incarcerated, what kind of risk they pose, what kind of rehabilitation they've shown, and determine whether or not it's safe to release that person. Because I don't think we can count on the legislature reversing all the sentence increases and sentence enhancements that they've added. They've not shown that kind of courage to do something like that, even though I think it's pretty clear it needs to be done. So,
Well, on that point, it seems like there was kind of this wave of support for criminal justice reform over the last decade, and people on the right and the left. You've got the Republican governor establishing a state commission on criminal justice reform and criminal justice and sentencing reform. I mean, Dave Olson said that one of the goals of that commission is to reduce the state prison population by 25% by 2025. Dave Olson said we're already down 13%. Seems like we're rolling back mass incarceration here.
no, unfortunately not. I think there have been some incremental things that have happened, and there has been a reduction in the prison population in Illinois. That is a fact. What's driven that reduction in the prison population? Well, the Sentencing Policy Advisory Council did an analysis of that and determined that it's driven by fewer arrests, mostly for drug crimes and for property crimes. Now, why that is, what's driving the decrease in arrests is, people can argue about. I don't think there's clear data that says whether it's something the police are doing, whether people are committing fewer crimes, or exactly why that is. But the fact is, fewer people are being arrested, therefore fewer people being convicted, fewer admissions into prison. That is what has driven the decline in the prison population. What has not driven the decline in the prison population is any statewide piece of legislation or change in policy that's been enacted over the last few years, or if there have been any decreases because of those reasons, they've been vanishingly small. The big work, the changes that have been recommended by that commission that you mentioned that need to happen have mostly not been enacted into law. There are a great set of recommendations, but we haven't seen the political courage to actually move forward and turn those recommendations into the law of the land. And so, we've, in my opinion, we've kind of, we've stalled out a little bit, and we have some folks wanting to do a victory lap and say that we've transformed the system and look at the decline in the prison population and say, yeah, good for us, we did that. Guess what, we didn't do that. That happened, but trends in arrests can go down, they can go back up again. We need to do the things to the system to control the factors we can control to reduce the prison population safely, sustainably, and permanently. And a downward trend in arrests is not going to accomplish that.
John, you were on that commission. What's going on? Why haven't the recommendations been?
I work a little harder, I guess. Right?
Yeah. Come on, man.
No, I think what Ben said is mostly right. I think what was important about the commission, it went over 2 years, and so I think we built up a lot of knowledge. Ben was, we had kind of official members, but we had a lot of people who followed it really closely. And I think we developed some knowledge of the system that we didn't really have before. I think actually laying out a goal, I think a few governors have now done that. By the time Governor Rauner made that goal, I think it was the first time a governor had said we want to see not just a reduction or something, we want to see a targeted reduction over a targeted period of time. So I think introducing that into the kind of vocabulary was really important. There were some recommendations I thought, which I would love to see enacted, which will be very tough. So Ben mentioned reforming of truth in sentencing, really longer sentences in general. I think when we first started that commission, that was politically off the table for the commissioners. It was a non-starter. But because we met over 2 years and we really looked at the research and we worked worked hard together. It was amazing. I think by the time we were actually voting on final recommendations, the people who were saying absolutely not were saying, well, yeah, we have to do this. So I think what that shows is that this is an issue that's going to require, it's like, I think the hardest thing about this issue is that, you know, our gut reactions are often always like really, really wrong. And this issue is like super counterintuitive. So, you know, I think it's easy for folks like us to get on stage and say, oh, you know, long sentences are so stupid, how could we ever do that? But I don't know, I always didn't do this work. I remember thinking long sentences were pretty good, you know, I mean, if I thought about it at all. And I think the criminal justice system is like shot through those kinds of really counterintuitive things. And it takes a lot of time and thought and work to kind of understand, like, well, you know, we want a smaller prison system because it's not really in our interest to have a large system. And we can do a much better job promoting public safety, you know, incapacitating the few people who really need to be incapacitated, but making sure we aren't using it excessively. So that includes, I mean, I think it's, you know, Dave Olson, folks who are right, you know, the kind of low-level nonviolent offender is a bit of a unicorn, but there is kind of a churner person in the population, a person who's, you know, your retail thief, property crime person, you know, I mean, I used to, I was the head of the John Howard Association, which is a nonpartisan prison watchdog, and one of the experiences that really stuck with me was visiting minimum security prisons and seeing these guys who were, you know, there for probably 7 months at a time, you know, usually there for retail, some drug issue, retail, you know, I know you've been to some of these places, you know, and like these are people with like, don't get me wrong, like really serious issues, you know, they're not some folks who just, if you just let go and don't do anything for them, they're going to steal again, they're going to cause some problems, they're going to really anger the community, retail owners are going to go there, you know, folks like Tim Fox and be like, do something about this guy, he stole like, you know, 50 times from me. And I think that's legitimate, like, yeah, that's a problem, but if you go to a prison, it's like, this is a ridiculous answer to that, and on every level. But I think I could get why the retail, you know, like a retailer might not have that immediate knowledge. So I think, you know, again, the commission, I think, just put some of those intuitions on the table. And I think, hopefully, it's some work that people can go back to. It can be kind of a document that we can return to. And I think, actually, again, going back to what I said first about the commission, which I think was really important, having, like, real goals. Because I think it's so easy in this work to kind of do something like this and kind of talk, and there's so much that's kind of wrong with the system. We can spend all day talking about things and not really get much done. And so I think if we become really goal-oriented and try to find compromises around that goal, we may not hit the exact goal, but we even get to like 15%. We're actually pretty close. I mean, when I first started this work, you know, Illinois prisons were like at 49,000. I thought they were going to go up and up and up. I did not think they would be at 41, whatever it is today. Like, whatever the cause is. I did not see that coming. I would not have predicted that. I don't think anyone really in this case was predicting that. So I think just getting people comfortable with, like, hey, you know, we can have lower prison population. That's okay. We don't have to send retail thieves to prison. That's okay. Providing that kind of comfort level hopefully will provide impetus for more work.
So you know, if any of you have anything, I don't know if any of you heard something tonight from one of the other folks that you want to hear.
So, you know, I think we can learn a lot from talking to my clients. They're the people who commit the crimes. And when I go to the Juvenile Temporary Detention Center or go to the alternative high schools in Chicago and I talk to these kids, and many of them are involved in the criminal justice. Obviously, the kids who are spending time in the Juvenile Detention Center, most of them are there for carrying a weapon, most of these young boys. And invariably, every time I talk to these kids, I have a whole Know Your Rights program. I tell them how to behave with police. I tell them what not to do. I tell them what the laws are. I tell them about their driver's license, how important it is, and they should hold on to it, and that sexting is a crime, and things like this. But when I ask them, the kids who are charged with having weapons, I say, what do I need to do to get you to put down the gun? And they always say the same thing. They say, I need to feel safe, and I need a job. And you know, most of these young kids that I'm talking to are 15, 16, 17. And some of them don't need a job, they need to be back in school. And I say that to them, I go, you need to get back in school. But it's all about the support system. Every one of us in this room have issues. We all have issues. I don't care what it is. We may be suffering from mental health issues. We may have a substance abuse issue. We may be depressed. All sorts of things. But we have a support system that helps us get through the issues so we don't go out and commit a crime. But when you got a kid or a young man or an emerging adult, 20, 21, who doesn't have a dime in their pocket and can't help support to put food on the table for their siblings or their mother, and has no hope of getting a job to do that, and nobody cares about them, has no mentor. Now, all anybody needs is one person to care about them. I say this all the time. I don't care what it is. I don't care if it's your faith-based leader, a mentor. Some of you could be mentors in this room, your lawyer, anyone. They can succeed. We gotta care about this generation, guys. We gotta care because they are our next leaders. They say the kids who have been through trauma, the type of trauma that they have seen from the age of 4 or 5 till they get to high school, till they come to our juvenile detention center, become my clients, or the emerging adults who end up at 26 in California and then go to prison for a year and come out. They say the kids who suffer trauma have an unbelievable ability to come back and be so strong and be our next leaders of this country. And if we start thinking about human capital that way, we won't put them in prison anymore. We'll help them on the front end. We'll help them on the back end. We'll put some money into these communities. We'll put some money in the schools, get them the trauma specialists they need, get them the counselors they need, get the police officers trained so they don't almost have to arrest, get lawyers in there so you don't expel and suspend every kid who's a problem. What do you think that's going to do? We heard about what a 19-year-old who was just expelled did, didn't we? He killed 17 people and injured 15 more yesterday. Because that's what happens when all of us fail together. I can't do it, Kim can't do it, John can't do it, Ben can't do it, Rob can't do it. And you in this community have to care about all the other communities. You have to care about the West Side. You have to care about my kids. Because I don't want my daughter who's going to school next year in Delaware to be shot up by some child who's suffering from a mental health issue. That everybody said, I guess it's your problem. Oh, I guess it's your problem. Or, I don't want to take the time to figure out the problem. I've been doing this 30 years. I have every kind of client. I've had the most horrific types of cases. I had a guy who killed an entire family. There were issues there. There were things there that could have been stopped before it was too late. We could have stopped this horrible, tragic. I'm representing the man who was charged with killing Commander Brown. It could have been prevented. But we've got to care. And we got to change what we're doing.
I just want to jump on that for a second. I agree with Amy. I'm very public about how I grew up in this city. And there's a reason that I do that. And I generally do it everywhere I go. So if you've ever heard me speak, you can roll your eyes like my children do. But I grew up in Cabrini, right? I grew up in Cabrini, the child of a teenage mother, 18 when she had me, 17 when she had my brother. My father was not in the home. I'm very open about my sexual abuse and assault as a child. The fact that we were homeless while I was in high school. I graduated from Lincoln Park High School. It's a classmate here. And I talk about that very frequently because people always say to me, always, without fail, how did you make it? How did you make it? Right? People in this room right now are wondering, how did you make it? That question is premised on the belief that I'm supposed to fail. And the failure isn't on my own personal resilience or my ability to come back from trauma or what have you. It's the recognition that you lived in public housing and concentrated poverty on top of each other. You probably had before you went to LaSalle Language Academy, which is where I transferred into 3rd grade. But when I was going to Sojourner Truth, that it was under-resourced and we had to move to Lincoln Park so that I could go to LaSalle Language Academy and so that I could get the education that I wasn't going to be able to get in Cabrini. And then because we couldn't afford to live in Lincoln Park, we moved from house to house to house, but I had housing instability for 8 years, and then months, and I was living in shelters on the north side. That is a lot. And to Amy's point, I am resilient. But I also have relatives who ended up in our criminal justice system, whose mother loved them just as much as they loved me, whose grandmother loved them just as much as they loved me. So I'm all for like mentorship. I'm here for that. But having lived this experience, if we acknowledge that we have systems of failure in education, in housing, in employment, in economic investment, when we herald people who make it out, and I may, with the belief that all of those systems that we know are failing our people in this city, and we're like, yeah, you made it. How can we live with people crawling through fences? How do we on the other side live with ourselves when we know that people are on the other side with failed systems? And so it is important. I agree that there's trauma, there are all these things. There are all of these things that I contend with, that I have family members, you know, I tell people all the time, my grandmother was a praying grandmother who could not in her wildest dream imagine that her daughter, who was a teenage mother twice at 18, would produce the first African American woman state's attorney. Why would she believe that? But at the same time, she produced a grandson that served 15 years in prison and was a GD. We sit at the same Thanksgiving table. And so the proximity to these issues, and I get real personal about it, because I can't help but get personal about it, because I sit around like fancy folks like John and Ben, and Amy, and I'm like, you know, and I'm like, yeah, I hear all of that, but I grew up in this life. And academics and statisticians and politicians talk about these communities as an other. But if I can be an example, right? Like the reason I do this is not for political favor. When I ran for this office as a prosecutor, saying, look, I'm from the projects, and I'm talking to communities that are impacted by our justice system. I'm talking to poor communities of color, saying I am one of you. Because usually in law enforcement, we talk to communities like you, and we pander to, aren't you scared? And I'm going to be the one to make you safe. And I'm here to tell you, you would probably be scared of a lot of people who I have Thanksgiving with. But I know what is possible from all of those failed systems that were around me. I know that all of those failed systems could have taken me under, but I know that they still exist. And so if we're going to have meaningful conversations, I just want to get back to this moment that we're in, to resist the urge to have a simple, quick fix. No, and we talk about Chicago, in the United States, we are an outlier in how we deal with criminal justice. And we pat ourselves on the back for these incremental things when we are an outlier. And if we believe in American exceptionalism, we are exceptionally bad at criminal justice when you look at the rest of the world. And it's not that we are worse people. It's not that we are more prone to violence. We have accepted this violence as a way of life, but we are addicted to a solution that has continued to fail by our unwillingness to acknowledge that there has been a lie told about what public safety looks like. It has been a lie. And if we have to acknowledge that lie, then we have to look back at the decades and actually centuries of policies that have disenfranchised communities. So I feel like I can never leave without saying that, because we will have these conversations over and over. The great work that these folks here will do will continue, but if we don't have a reckoning that when we see something so horrible happen, that our first response is more. Having seen what more has looked like, and to push ourselves to imagine what the other could be. And I think that's the problem. If we don't lock someone up, we ask ourselves, what do we do? We invest in our schools and restorative justice programming, and we don't suspend early. We invest in the fact that we don't have capable mental health capacity in community is crazy. That's crazy. crazy. People didn't stop having mental health issues when the clinics closed. They weren't like, oh, we don't have clinics anymore, well, I'm healed. They just went to other areas, hospitals and jails. And we know that. If the energy around the opioid crisis, which I'm excited that there's this level of energy and empathy for those who have public health issues or health issues, drug addiction is a health issue. If we are saying, let's put all our resources, congressional commissions, presidential commission, to help do something with this, then how do we live with ourselves every day at the march of people who come to 26 in California who are there with heroin addictions? We gotta walk and talk the same talk and believe that we can do an other. But if I serve for no other reason, I say well, if I leave this office and no one ever remembers anything that I've done, the 3 things that so I'm gonna do the other 3. Just remember that this is a girl who grew up in Cabrini, who had the potential to be a leader, despite every system designed to make me fail. And ask yourselves, how many leaders have we laid lying on the ground in a heap of blood and mess because we didn't make that investment in them?
Tease it out a little bit. I think one of the real dangers in the advocacy right now, I certainly saw it when I went, or it found its way into prison even. People in prison would say this, is like, well, once you're in prison, it's over for you. You're never gonna, you have X in your back, you never get a job. One thing I would hear was very telling, like, oh, I can't even vote in Illinois. Like, yes, you can. We don't do that in Illinois. You aren't disenfranchised. And I think some of that comes from, in advocacy, we want to be the saviors of people, and we want people to redeem. And I think what's so, and Kim's story, she's, very humble person, and I think there aren't a whole lot of Kim Foxes in the world, but still, I think what was amazing of people that I've been able to work with in my work in the criminal justice system is, you can never quite tell when someone's going to change their life. People, I've worked around people working in homelessness and criminal justice, prisons, and people who have had really serious problems, and people can change their life. People are super resilient. They're unpredictable. It's amazing. And I think so again, for lay citizens, for advocates who wants to don't go into this work to save people. Okay? I think go into this work to hold people up, to hold up the possibility for redemption and resilience. And I think it's at the same time it's right to acknowledge yes, we have a system that really puts a lot on you. It's going to be very hard. But, I know so many people who have succeeded. And, artists are totally amazing human beings. I think, I love asking people who have, had a lot of experience with the criminal justice system. So, who have changed their life? And I ask, I always get a moment where I ask, so what happened? What changed you? And I think almost every time I've always heard the same answer. It's like, well, I realized I really want to help, people like me. That's so awesome. I think our system will lock those people out of those kinds of opportunities, but I think what that really speaks to is, I think a very human desire to help people, to be together, to kind of redeem oneself. And I think I wanted to say one more thing, and I hope I say this in a way that's not too provocative. So, I grew up in the church, we're in a house of worship, and I think we have to be careful too at being too utopian about human beings. So I think we have awesome capacity to redeem ourselves, to do great work. There's a level, I'm not a particularly religious person anymore, but I also believe we live in a fallen world and bad things are going to happen. And it goes back to what Kim was saying, the criminal justice system is not the answer to every bad thing. Sometimes, I think we should always be looking at every awful event, ask ourselves, okay, what could we have done to prevent this? How did this happen? But I think we also need to realize that, and certainly a severe response in the criminal justice system is not going to bring back someone's life and make the world a better place. And I think on some level, the questions we need to be asking ourselves is, are we doing this all we can to make the world the best place it can be for ourselves and our children, but also recognize that, there's no eradicating the kind of wickedness that we saw a few days ago. I mean, that's just going to happen. It's going to happen every year. And again, we can't let ourselves be seduced by thinking, oh, okay, well, if only this guy was in prison. Or, you know, even, well, no, I guess that's my main response. So I think it's so easy to do that. And it's just, I think it's just unrealistic.
So we've kind of turned to like kind of advice or like suggestions you might have for these folks for ways people can get involved. Are there any more? We're going to open it up for questions in a second. Are there any more?
I say one thing. So again, I think the more I do this, the more I think, you know, and I've been with Ben, I've lobbied in Springfield, and you know, changing laws are great. At the end of the day, though, criminal justice is a local level activity, and we need really good leaders to lead these agencies who can, you know, set good examples for their staff. That's really where the action is. So I think it's, you know, and again, I don't mean this in a political way, but it's so great to have people like Amy and Kim kind of in these offices. It's not always been the case. And I think, you know, when you're voting for alderman, mayor, et cetera, you know, or elected officials like Kim, you know, make sure you hold them accountable. Because legislators will, you know, at the state level or the federal level, will sometimes act as if they can provide all this change. And I think ultimately, you know, the change that occurs at the state level, certainly the federal level, is pretty minimal, especially when it can be done at the local level.
All right, so we're going to have some questions, and we're going to do this in a less than perfect way. I'm just going to walk around with the mic, but I'm not going to let go of the mic in case someone wants to speechify for too long. I can yank it. But so does anyone have a question or a comment? Yes, sir.
Yes, well, we've seen that, we've heard that we need to invest in the people when they get out of prison for parole or whatever, and provide some support for them at that point, and it's going to pay big dividends in the future because there won't be people go back and we won't have the additional full prisons. Now, what are we going to do to get the legislature to wake up to that and provide the investment today to save billions tomorrow?
I think it's you all, it's the electorate. I think there's a strong fear of that the public doesn't want that. I think the elected officials, the political will to do this, and again, I've been an elected official just a little over a year, and some of the things that I want to do with the retail theft policy, you would have thought that I was like taking everyone's babies. And I understood the reaction, but it was the things that I read about myself. You are descending into lawlessness. We stopped, you know, prosecuting people for driving on a suspended license for failure to pay tickets, right? We were putting people in jail because they couldn't pay their tickets, but they can't like earn money because they're in jail. So we're like doing this stupid cycle. When I did that, I had partners in law enforcement say, you are descending into lawlessness. Like when I'm doing these things, and then you go to these meetings, you know, I just in the last 24 hours, you know, as a result of what's happened with Commander Bauer, it's like it's Fox and her bond reform, and it's like he wasn't on bond, and you can't do. There's this fear, and you know, John's point cannot be like underscored enough that you have to have elected officials who aren't wedded to gut reaction. There's enough research. There's enough research that Ben and ACLU and others have done over the course of years that justify these alternatives. But elected officials, and I'm part of a prosecutors association. Not everybody in the state of Illinois believes the same thing that I believe. And in those jurisdictions, they are clinging to these things. And so there is not that consistency, but they do it because they believe that that's what you want. Your elected official believes that you don't want to invest in people who come out of prison, that you have judged them unworthy, and therefore they will not disappoint you. So you have to affirmatively fight for these things with your elected officials.
I just want to jump off that. I couldn't agree more with what the state's attorney Fox said, and I think the reason that we've had politicians attack each other as soft on crime and put the scary face of Willie Horton on the screen and all of that sort of thing is because it's worked. It's been effective. People have won elections behind that kind of thing. And so in order for that to really change in a real and permanent way, people have to stop winning elections behind that kind of thing. And that means that the people who are voting and the people who are represented by the elected officials, you all and the other people in your communities, need to engage with your elected officials and tell them that. And ask them, tell them what's important to you and be vocal about rejecting that fear-mongering approach. And if they don't listen, turn them out of office, because that's the only, that's the way that you get politicians to behave differently around this, is you vote against them if they won't listen to what the community really wants.
Let me just add one thing. I think you should support organizations that are trying to help people re-enter into society, whether that's with your time, your money, your support of that person. Support people like Ben and other ACLU who are trying to get legislators to bring back parole, rehabilitative parole. I mean, we're all in this together. Nobody wants violence. Nobody wants crime. We're all citizens first before we have our other jobs. And I think if we get people to think about that kind of thing, and you support the people who believe in what you believe and you know what works. I mean, Ben and they're doing some amazing things, the John Howard Association, you know, and the more support you have, the community, as you know, has all the power. You really do. You are the ones who have the power to make the change. You know, you just have to stand up, right? You can be part of the landscape, you can be part of the problem, or you can be part of the solution. And it's never too late to be part of the solution.
Can I piggyback off with that? I mean, yes, the elected official thing is so right. So deterrence might not work in criminal justice, but it works pretty well in like a environment of legislators, right? So sending a message, we talk about like legislators sending messages, they won't receive messages that people lose. I would recommend even, you know, so if you have an association of churches across the state, I think it's also, you know, legislators coming out of this district probably aren't too, you know, they're going to be behind this sort of stuff. It needs to be, you know, you need to reach downstate. And I think, you know, coming from a religious perspective is a great way to do that. But I think it's, you know, when someone demagogues this issue, they need to be punished for it. And I think that's, outside of that, we're not going to, it won't change.
All right, I think we have a question here. Yes.
Amy, could you tell us a little bit more about what has actually happened with the Restorative Justice Court? Expand on that, you referred to it as successful. Tell us.
Well, what's happening is it's pretty new. We started in what, July? And what the point is, in the community is where the court is. It's not in a building at 26th Street or downtown. So the community, you have a table, and the judge sits at the table with everybody else. You have members of the community who sit at the table, whether they're social service providers, other members of the community, maybe someone from the faith-based churches from the community, and then you have the offender, you have the victim, you have the state's attorney, you have the public defender, and you talk about the harm that occurred from the crime. And you talk about, okay, what does this person who was harmed need? What does the offender need to stop the offender from committing these types of crimes? And we think of solutions together with members of the community because, guess what? The offender and the victim live in the community. And this arose out of Ireland. And it's a funny story because the community of Ireland, when the IRA, and there were bombings and Molotov cocktails being thrown, the community was very dissatisfied with what the court was doing with these violent kids. And the community said, we're going to take it over. You're not doing what we want. We're going to sit down. We're going to bring people to the table. We're going to figure out why this kid is doing this. And we're going to stop it. And it worked. And it's in Australia. It started in Europe. It started in Ireland. And now we've brought it to the United States. I think we're one of the very first restorative justice courts. And the cases come in, and Kim decides whether or not this person is sort of eligible. But the people who are involved are the people who are committing the crimes in North Lawndale, and the victims are from North Lawndale. And it all started out of a restorative justice hub. A hub, and we have Michelle Day, who's in the audience, who is part of a hub. A hub is a group of people from a community that get together and figure out what to do with community problems. And we have 5 restorative justice hubs in the city. I think we have, I don't know them all, but we have Back of the Yards, North Lawndale, Little Village, and I forget where else. I was in Eaglewood last week and they don't have one there, and I've said, you need to start a hub. And basically it's people getting together, talking about what's happening in the community. It's not just crime, it's other issues you have in your community, whatever that is. Maybe the schools are closing. Maybe this store needs help to stay open, whatever it is. Maybe this person down the block needs help for some reason. So the community comes together and solves the problems of the community. And that's what restorative justice is. But it's a way of thinking not of punishment, right? It's repairing harm. It changes your mindset about what we need to do. And it has lasting effects. People invest in the community. The offender is invested. Maybe they do community service. Maybe they get their treatment by the person who's sitting next to them during court. They're going to help them with their mental health treatment, or get them back in school, or get housing. Whatever the needs are for the offender, the victim, and the community as a whole. So that's what restorative justice is. And it's going to work because it's worked across the world.
Okay, anyone on this side? Thought I'd give the north side a chance. Right.
Hi, I'm Ellen Corley. I go to this church and have been involved with this, and it's really been a great experience. I'm really grateful that John and Dee Dee and everyone else helped pull this together. It's a couple of things. One, I thank you for your talk, and as we think what we can do next, I noticed in our books this Confronting, Getting Involved section has some great ideas. And I hadn't heard of this, the John Howard, there's an advocacy camp at Restore Justice this Sunday in the afternoon. I've been involved, started with Organizing for Action, the Obama's thing, about 3 years ago, Fellows Program, looking at gun violence, got involved with the Next movement, looking for coalitions, then got involved with the Chicago Alliance Against Racist Political Repression, pushing for CPAC and getting innocent people, getting Browner to let some of these innocent people getting out of jail, which we're big fans of Kim's because she's really taken that up, and it's a great issue. But here's my question for today. According to a new documentary, The Invisible War, 30% of female military recruits are raped in the military, and with no prosecution. 30%. It's out there now. And I speculate, and we're trying to get people to come forward regarding victims of police rape here in Chicago. But I see on the ICJIA website that the agency provides direct services to victims of violent crime. Could you tell us about how many victims have been helped by this grant? And specifically, if there's a way to start convicting and tracking police and military perpetrators of violent crime, which are currently not prosecuted. And another issue is why don't we know why violent crime arrests are down? And why can't we get federal and state legislation passed that requires that all crimes, metrics, and statistics are captured and tracked and monitored to standards of 100% transparency and accountability in terms of zero tolerance for the code of silence regarding police crime, which is currently, I'd say, the biggest perpetrator of gang terrorism, rape, torture, and wrongful conviction out there.
A lot there. I can talk about, and I'm glad you actually brought up the victimization or victim Victim Services. So I'm a director of an agency that, it's a state agency that's basically in charge of grant-making criminal justice in the state of Illinois and research. And in part through a huge infusion of federal dollars that comes out of a formula fund called the Victim of Crime Act, we are the largest provider or funder of victim services throughout the state. Our fund went from about $18 million in 2014 to about $78 million in 15. And it's been level more or less since then. So we have this huge increase in victim services, and I'll just tell you a really quick story about that. When we started with that huge, I mean, that might sound like, wow, what a great thing to have this huge increase. It's also terrifying, because I was pretty new at my job, and we never handled that kind of increase before on anything. At the federal level, you have 3 years to spend those dollars. And so we wanted to do it right. We wanted to strengthen services that we'd funded before, that's around sexual assault, domestic violence, some child abuse. But we also wanted to make sure that we were reaching into areas of victimization that we'd never funded before, community violence, for example. So the first thing we did is we did a poll across the country, what are people doing with this huge infusion of dollars to expand services? And what we found in the vast majority of states was that they were basically just taking what they had already funded and multiplying it by 4. And that's just, that kind of speaks to how I think government often thinks about these sorts of issues, very quantitative. They don't really often have the infrastructure to think deeply about it. So we have a research unit, so we were able to think deeply about it. And we embarked on about a 9-month process of doing a lot of research, focus groups, surveys, stakeholder convening, to figure out, again, how can we strengthen the services that we already funded, but also expand. And that process has gone really, really well. Not only have we expanded, again, places like community violence, civil legal services, we've expanded, we require all of our programs to be trained in trauma, for example. But the really cool thing about this is that whereas most states have had actually a really hard time spending these dollars, and they're looking to actually return funds back to the feds, we're in a position actually we're spending 100% of our funds. So we've really maxed out, kind of tapped the potential of these victim service funds. That's, I think, good for the state of Illinois, but I think it's, on a personal level, I think at the agency, victim service, I think, is where it's at. My own work came out of the criminal, especially corrections, criminal justice. I hadn't really thought deeply about victim services, especially domestic violence. And I think the most exciting thinking, innovative thinking is going on in domestic violence, especially for services for community violence. And the reason it's so innovative is because it kind of speaks to what Amy and Kim were both saying. It's people who have worked with victims who realize the line between victim and offender is pretty porous, if non-existent. And oftentimes, I think especially just in domestic violence, the victim does not want her abuser to go to prison. She wants the violence to stop, and prison won't do that. In fact, prison can make it much, much worse. So we've done a lot in the last 2.5, 3 years to improve victim services. I was trying to find, we actually looked at numbers today. I think we went from I'm going to make this, I won't make it up. It's been a huge increase because of the money. But I think more importantly, it's been a real qualitative increase that I'm hoping to build on. And so other questions you asked about, these are funds that we have to have a report about. It doesn't have to be a process crime, but it needs to actually be a crime. And you actually need to be a victim of a crime. So, without that, these services can't kick in. That's just kind of the federal conditions. So I don't know, I hope I've answered some of your questions. There's more there if anyone else wants to pick them up.
Any final thoughts for the evening from any of you? Not to put the pressure on.
Well, I would just add that I think you can get involved. Whatever that is in this community, like we talked about, supporting agencies that are doing good work, helping victims of crime who, as you know, if you don't know, most of my clients were victims before they were offenders of something, whether it was domestic violence in their home or the trauma they see on their way to school. You don't just be born and say, gee, when I grow up, I want to carry a gun and I want to join a gang and I don't want to have a job. And, that doesn't happen, right? It happens because of all the things that happen in our lives. So if someone along the way sees what's happening with that individual and the victimization that's happening and stops it, we can help those people be productive members of society and our next leaders, whatever that is. So you can get involved in any kind of agency in your organization. You can become, I think, part of your school board would be key. And make sure that the schools are giving due process to children and that they are following the rules and they don't have these zero tolerance policies for silly things. And they're kicking children out or even suspending them. You know, when a child is suspended from school, it stays with that child in their mind. And again, they become marginalized, and you don't know what that can do. Then the mental health issue becomes, and they become depressed. And then it just, snowballs. So we have to be very careful how we treat our children. Very careful. How do we talk to them? And we need all the help we can get. And you should demand of your schools that they have social workers, that they have trauma specialists, that they have whatever the needs the kids are. And that's on your elected officials, right? That's on the Chicago Public Schools. And that's for all of us to care about. So, and I would say you could be a mentor. When I spoke up north at a church, last year, I said, you can come to the South Side. You go to a meeting at any one of these where the church has put on this, and you say, I want to be a mentor. And you take a child out of their environment. And they, some of these kids have never even been to Lake Michigan, and they live 2 blocks from Lake Michigan. They only know the block they live on. So if you take them away, or they know the criminal justice system, that's a shame. So you take them out of their environment, you get involved in an after-school program, or, a men's program if it's for boys. I think boys relate very well with men. We need male mentors, things like that. There's lots of ways to get involved and support good agencies that are doing good work.
Can I add one thing? So I think, you're here, so I think you're curious, and I think one of the most exciting things about the last, even 5 years is that the thinking that's going on right now is really great. I mean, even so when I first started this, there just wasn't, the books that would come out, articles that would come out were pretty sterile, and it's not the case anymore. So I would encourage, even just go on Amazon and start doing some exploring in terms of what's being written right now, because there's some really amazing work being done. I do think this is a problem that it requires action, but it requires a lot of thinking. And thankfully, there's some really good thinkers right now doing the work.
And you have a lot of those materials in the binders that John handed out, and I would like to thank you and commend you for all being out and learning about this over the last 4 weeks. Thank you for letting me be a part of it. Thanks to John for organizing all these events. And thank you to our panelists for coming this time.
It's a very emotional subject. As you said, you have a response that's built in. But one of the things, an idea that I just want to share with everyone is to look at the writings of the author James Baldwin. James Baldwin is an absolute hero of mine. I thought about when Ms. Fox said it goes through her mind when she sees a 12-year-old with a gun. Why does a 12-year-old have a gun? So you're thinking about the motivation. What went on first that led them to get the idea to get a gun? And there is a documentary on James Baldwin. It is called, I'm going to leave one of the words out because I find it extremely offensive and I'm not going to say it. The documentary is called I Am Not The, and it's an N word that I'm sure everybody knows here, that is derogatory, that is used to humiliate people, to make them feel that they are worthless, to make them feel that they are not reflected in the community. That's one of the things James Baldwin talked about. When he was growing up in Harlem, he wondered why his father came home angry all the time, and why his father was an alcoholic. And he said he couldn't understand until later on it was because, just as you were saying, from experience, direct experience, his father could not afford to feed his family. He was humiliated by that. That helped to lead him to have a problem with alcohol. If you want to call it substance abuse, but with alcohol, because he felt helpless. He was angry. He saw a system as James Baldwin. I'm repeating James Baldwin's ideas. James Baldwin felt that the system, long before it gets to become a crime, any sort of crime, the system is rigged against certain people. There are reasons why highways are built in certain areas, why there's public transportation in certain areas, and other areas are cut off, why there's not access to education. And in this documentary, all of these topics are addressed by him. I think he's one of the greatest, most profound thinkers of the 20th century. And relevant in the 21st century. And I imagine, unfortunately, I hope he won't be relevant in the 22nd century, but he probably will be as a realist. And people don't like to accept hard realities. That's the truth. One of the things that he says is that people want to feel good about themselves. People want to feel good about themselves. And they place all the negative parts of themselves onto others who don't have the resources, the advantages, the education, all of the good things that everybody should have. They don't have them, and they demonize them. And he says very accurately, I knew by the time I was 13 years old, I knew I was not a N-word. I knew it. I knew it. So I had to ask myself, why am I being told this? Why is my family being told this? Why is everyone in the community being told this? He lived about 125th Street in Harlem and near Park Avenue. And he had to say, not the Park Avenue that you think of in New York, or that most people think of. What did we play with? We played with the dirt in the street. You know, we played with, they weren't toys. We didn't have those things. But he goes back to the point, I'm not this person that you've said I am, but you have said I am. Therefore, it came from you. You felt this. You created it. So you are the problem. I am not the problem. You are the problem.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Remarks, which I think we all join in spirit. And as painful as it is, it brings us back to where we started, because we do see in this situation, which has been so movingly discussed by our panelists this evening and in prior weeks, something more than simply administrative error, something more than policy defects. We see a spirit, an indifference, negative spirit, indifference that is important and needs to be recognized. I want to thank our speakers for their moving remarks, which appropriately went well beyond the scope of their official duties to recognize some of the real issues that need to be addressed. I hope that you'll all continue with your journey in exploring and considering these issues and doing what you can to respond to them. Ellen mentioned an advocacy camp that's described in detail in the materials that were updated today. Hope you'll consider that. As Amy mentioned, Michelle Day is here, or was here, one of our leaders in restorative justice in the city, and she can tell you more about the restorative justice session that takes place on Tuesday, February 24th, and there are other engagement and breadth of your representatives for you to either support, or in the case of the legislation that Amy described and that I mentioned in this piece, the most recently introduced legislation which maybe should not be supported in terms of how it is handling and further criminalizing the activity of driving around in a stolen car. I hope you'll all consider, as someone suggested, donating to and contributing other ways to organizations that are doing the work, to do the studies that are necessary, to make the advocacy that's required, and to provide the services that are needed. I hope you all turn in your name tags. We're not necessarily done with you. We may try to do something else in the future, so we'll be in touch. And thank you very much for your participation.